On a humid Georgia morning in 1851, the workers at the Hateville cotton facility thought they'd seen everything, until they found their overseer crushed beneath the iron press he'd ruled with. His skull flattened, his body positioned neatly beneath the machine, as if placed there by the same precise hands that once operated it. But this wasn't an accident, nor the work of a grown man. The wheel of that cotton press had been turned 17 times, by someone barely 4 feet tall, a child, a slave, a boy bought for just 8 cents. His name, if history can even call it that, was Thomas. What happened that night wasn't just murder. It was rebellion, a moment when the smallest hand in Georgia's cotton empire struck back at the weight of an entire system built to crush him. What drove an 11-year-old boy, broken, deformed, and enslaved, to orchestrate one of the most haunting acts of vengeance in American history? Before we open the pages of this forgotten nightmare, take a second to help keep these buried stories alive. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this documentary with someone who still believes history is only what's written in textbooks. Because what you're about to hear, the story of the 8-cent boy, was almost erased from history. Let's make sure it never is again. It began before dawn on September 14, 1851, when the fog still clung to the red Georgia soil like breath against glass. The men arriving at the Hateville cotton processing facility were used to the sounds of labor, the heavy groan of machinery, the thud of bales, the crack of leather cutting through morning air. But that morning, something was different. The air felt still, unnaturally quiet. A few lanterns still flickered inside the main building, their light trembling over the iron beasts that stood waiting to devour the day's cotton. Then came the first shout, a sound so sharp and panicked it sliced through the silence. Within minutes, the workers gathered near the main press, where a shape lay sprawled beneath a layer of white fiber that wasn't cotton at all but soaked red. There, half buried beneath the enormous steel plate, was what had once been their overseer, Tobias Stroud, his body almost untouched, but his head gone. The iron plate rested just inches above his neck, and where his skull should have been was only a dark, crushed mass, pressed flat into the wood. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy," but no one moved closer. The cotton press was still warm. Its wheel, 8 feet high, had been turned exactly 17 times, enough pressure to compress a man's head into nothing but pulp and memory. By sunrise, the news had spread through Hateville like a contagion. White men rode in from nearby plantations, drawn by the gruesome rumors, while the enslaved workers stood silent in small groups, eyes lowered, expressions unreadable. Sheriff Edmund Howell arrived just after 7, his horse kicking up dust as he dismounted, squinting at the sight before him. He'd seen men shot, hanged, beaten to ribbons, but never this. This was deliberate, methodical. The iron wheel was still locked in place as though the killer had wanted it left that way. "How many turns?" Howell asked the foreman. 17, sir," the man stammered. 17 exact. Howell bent closer to the machine, his eyes catching on a small, strange detail. A wooden stool, crudely built from scrap lumber, placed neatly beside the wheel. Its surface was scuffed, as if someone had been standing on it, shifting weight again and again. He crouched, tracing his fingers along the marks. "Who here needs a stool to reach the wheel?" he asked, turning to the line of frightened faces. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the buzz of flies gathering in the heat. It was then that Howell noticed something else. Small footprints near the grease stains. Not a man's, not even a youth's. A child's. By mid-morning, the sheriff began his questioning. 12 enslaved workers had been on the night shift, supervised directly by Stroud, as always during harvest season. The machines had run through the night, turning raw cotton into profit, and the noise, the rhythm, could have hidden anything, even murder. "You hear anything strange?" Howell asked the first man, a tall worker named Prophet. "No, sir, just the press, same as every night." "See anyone near it?" "Only Mr. Stroud and the boy." Howell frowned. "What boy?" The man hesitated, eyes flicking toward the others before he answered. "The small one, sir. Thomas." The sheriff wrote the name down, though it was unfamiliar to him. "Where is he now?" Silence. Someone finally murmured, "Gone, sir." Howell turned sharply. "Gone where?" The man only shrugged. "Ain't here, sir. His bed's empty." The sheriff ordered the storage barn searched, and there, by a small crate that served as a bedside, they found a folded blanket, a tin cup, a stone polished smooth by handling, and, lying neatly on top, a small wooden sign scorched with words, 8-cent boy. Howell held it up, his face tightening as he read the crude letters. "What the devil is this?" he asked. No one answered, but the truth began to stir in the minds of those who saw it. The horror not just of a man's death, but of what it might have meant for a child bought for less than the price of a handful of nails. By the time the sun reached its peak, the cotton press had gone cold. The sheriff's men had cordoned off the area, and the body of Tobias Stroud was covered with a sheet that did nothing to hide the stains spreading through it. Hateville itself seemed to hold its breath. The plantation owners whispered about rebellion. The workers whispered about justice. In the center of it all stood that monstrous machine, its steel mouth dripping oil and blood, its wheels still set in the position it had been left, as though frozen mid-confession. Howell stared at it for a long while before muttering to his deputy, "This wasn't rage. This was patience." He was right. Somewhere in the sweltering woods or the endless fields of Georgia, a child with twisted legs and haunted eyes was on the run. A child who had spent months learning exactly how that press worked and exactly how to make it sing its final, terrible note. The boy who had been bought for 8 cents had turned the machinery of his own oppression into a weapon, and in doing so had shattered the order of Hateville forever. Long before blood stained the wooden floorboards of the cotton press, Hateville was a name spoken with quiet pride among Georgia's planter elite. A small town built on profit and cruelty, it sat like a beating heart in the middle of a cotton empire that stretched as far as the horizon. From a distance, it looked almost picturesque. Whitewashed homes with tall porches, wagons loaded with raw cotton rolling past fields that shimmered beneath the sun like a sea of white flowers. But up close, the beauty was deception. The wealth that built those houses and kept those wagons moving came from broken backs, chained wrists, and sleepless nights spent under the weight of labor no human body was meant to endure. By 1851, Hateville's cotton processing facility had become the centerpiece of this operation. A sprawling complex of warehouses, pulleys, and steam-powered presses that turned the labor of the enslaved into neat, saleable bales for northern factories. The men who owned those plantations saw themselves as pillars of civilization, but the empire they built was rooted in human suffering, its foundation soaked in sweat, blood, and silence. The man at the top of Hateville's machinery was Cyrus Gantry, a cotton broker who inherited the facility from his father and expanded it into one of Georgia's most profitable enterprises. Gantry wasn't a planter himself. He didn't grow cotton, he processed it. His money came from efficiency, charging plantation owners for every pound that passed through his presses, every hour the machines ran. He wore fine suits imported from Philadelphia and spoke in the polished tones of a businessman. But his fortune was built on the same enslaved hands that picked the cotton he compressed. Beneath his courteous exterior, Gantry was coldly pragmatic. He didn't believe in cruelty for its own sake. He believed in control. And for control, he needed overseers like Tobias Stroud, men willing to enforce his will with precision and brutality. Stroud had a reputation that made even the other white men uncomfortable. He didn't just demand obedience, he enjoyed it. Where Gantry measured profit in dollars, Stroud measured it in fear. He kept ledgers detailing every strike of the whip, every hour stolen from the bodies of those beneath him. To the enslaved workers, he wasn't just a man. He was the embodiment of the system itself, iron, unbending, and without mercy. Daily life in Hateville revolved around the rhythm of the cotton press, a sound that could be heard for miles, like the heartbeat of a monster. At dawn, enslaved men and women arrived in chains of exhaustion, their bare feet coated in red dust. By noon, the air inside the facility grew thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and fiber. The noise was constant, the clank of gears, the creak of wood, the hiss of steam, a metallic symphony that drowned out human voices. Work began before sunrise and stretched well past midnight during harvest season, the pace so relentless that even strong men collapsed beside the machines, too drained to move. Deaths were not uncommon. Crushed limbs, infections, exhaustion. But they were recorded only as losses, not lives. To the white owners, the enslaved were not people. They were numbers that kept the machines turning. Each worker was assigned a quota, and failure to meet it meant punishment. Whips cracked through the air like punctuation marks in a sentence no one had the power to rewrite. And standing among it all, watching, was Tobias Stroud, the man who would soon become both executioner and victim within this empire of spinning steel. What made Hateville unique was not its size, but its secrecy. Plantation owners liked to think of it as the engine of Southern prosperity, but those who worked there knew it as something closer to hell, a place where screams were drowned out by machinery and where punishment came as swiftly as the turning of a wheel. The enslaved people who lived in its shadow developed their own kind of code, a quiet resilience that passed from one generation to the next. They sang songs that sounded like hymns but carried warnings hidden in their verses. They learned how to work with their eyes down and their minds alert, how to survive inside a system that treated survival itself as defiance. In Hateville, cruelty was predictable, but hope was dangerous. Yet even there, in the heart of Georgia's white-flowered empire, the smallest spark of resistance was already forming. In the mind of a boy who watched, who listened, and who understood more about those machines than anyone ever realized. That spark, fed by humiliation and sharpened by intelligence, would soon burn through the fragile order of Hateville, leaving behind only the sound of iron and the memory of vengeance. To understand the horror that unfolded in Hateville, you have to understand the man at its center, Tobias Stroud. At first glance, he was nothing remarkable. An average-sized man in his early 40s, with sun-leathered skin and a permanent squint from years spent in the Georgia glare. But beneath that unassuming exterior lived a mind that took pleasure in order, in punishment, and in power over those who had none. Stroud wasn't born wealthy, nor was he born into ownership. He earned his place in the hierarchy through obedience to cruelty. By 1851, he'd been overseeing Gantry's cotton facility for nearly a decade, and in that time, he'd turned it into a monument to efficiency and fear. Every movement of every enslaved worker was recorded in his leather-bound ledger. Hours worked, tasks completed, punishments given. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a craftsman of discipline, a man who turned human beings into cogs in a system that could never stop turning. And yet, behind that obsession with order was something darker, a strange fixation on things that were broken. His house stood only a few yards from the main facility, small and neat, with its windows always shuttered even in the hottest months. Inside, it was filled with the oddest collection anyone in Hateville had ever seen. Cracked pottery glued back together, clocks that no longer told time, chairs with mismatched legs. He would spend his nights hunched over them, fitting pieces together in silence, his rough fingers tracing fractures with almost tender precision. When asked why he surrounded himself with junk, he would answer, "Because broken things have meaning. They prove something was once whole." That philosophy extended beyond objects. To Stroud, the enslaved weren't people. They were tools, and like the cracked cups and bent nails in his house, their value lay in how he could shape them back into usefulness. He took pride in taking the weakest, the most damaged, and forcing them into productivity. It was his private gospel. That pain was the path to purpose. So when he heard about a boy being sold for less than the cost of a nail, it didn't disgust him. It fascinated him. Stroud had always been drawn to spectacles of human degradation, attending auctions not out of necessity but curiosity. He liked to study the ones nobody wanted, the maimed, the old, the sick, as though they were puzzles waiting for his touch. When Nathaniel Vickers' estate held its liquidation auction that cold February morning, Stroud went not intending to buy, but to watch. That was until Lot 17 was brought out, a small, twisted figure no higher than a man's hip. The boy's limbs were uneven, his back curved, his oversized clothes hanging off him like a costume. The auctioneer's voice was cold, clinical. Dwarf, Negro boy, approximately 11 years of age, left arm shorter than right, feet turned inward. There was laughter in the crowd, cruel, careless laughter, because the bidders knew this boy had no value. "Start the bidding at 50, the auctioneer said. Silence. 30. Still silence. At 10, a man snorted. 5 came next, followed by jeers. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single voice cut through. 8 cents. The laughter stopped. Heads turned, and there was Stroud, calm, serious, already pulling the copper coins from his pocket. He placed them on the auctioneer's table one by one, like a priest offering tithe to some dark altar. When the auctioneer called "sold," a chill went through the crowd. Even among men accustomed to treating humans as property, the sale felt obscene. A child traded for the price of pocket change. Stroud only smiled faintly and approached the block, looking down at the boy who stared back with blank, expressionless eyes. "You're mine now," Stroud said softly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of possession. "You'll work for me, and you'll earn your worth." The boy said nothing, only nodded once, but those who saw him that day would later recall the moment. The quiet intensity in his gaze, the spark that flickered behind it like the faint glow of a dying ember waiting for air. Stroud took him to the facility and announced to the workers, "This is what I paid 8 cents for, and he'll earn every one of them." The enslaved men and women looked at the child with pity and fear. They knew what it meant to be singled out by Tobias Stroud. In that moment, the man who collected the broken found his most fragile possession yet, and in trying to make that boy useful, he unknowingly sealed his own fate. For in the heart of that small, misshapen child, something was already mending. Not submission, but resolve. The morning of the auction was cold, gray, and thick with the kind of silence that sits heavy on a crowd pretending not to feel. The estate of Nathaniel Vickers had been reduced to a list on a piece of parchment: livestock, furniture, tools, and people. All of them priced, all of them waiting to be claimed by someone with more money and less mercy. The auctioneer's voice rang across the square, practiced and hollow, calling out bids as if he were reading from scripture. Men in long coats leaned on canes, chewing tobacco, squinting at teeth and muscles as if they were buying mules. To them, these weren't lives but investments. And then came lot number 17. The murmuring in the crowd quieted, not out of respect but discomfort. Onto the wooden block stepped a boy, small, deformed, wearing a coat that swallowed his body whole. The description in the ledger was brutal in its simplicity. Dwarf, Negro boy, approximately 11 years of age, proportions irregular. The boy's eyes, dark and distant, scanned the crowd without expectation. He knew this routine. He'd been displayed before. He'd been weighed by stares heavier than chains. What he didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, was that in just a few minutes his fate would be sealed for the cost of a handful of copper pennies. At first, no one bid. Even among slave traders, the boy was considered worthless. Too weak for the field, too fragile for labor. Some men laughed, others whispered about bad omens. "He'll never survive a season," one scoffed. The auctioneer dropped the price again and again, his patience wearing thin. $10, he called. 5. 1. Still nothing. Finally, his tone changed from pride to pity. 8 cents, came a mocking voice from the back. Tobias Stroud, his expression unreadable. The men around him chuckled, assuming it was a joke, but Stroud wasn't smiling. He stepped forward, placed 8 copper coins on the table, and said, "He's mine." The sound of those coins, one by one, echoed through the morning air, metallic and cruel. Even the auctioneer hesitated, glancing toward Vickers' widow for approval. She nodded once, eager to finish the sale and leave Georgia behind. "Sold," the man said flatly, and with that, a child's worth was defined. Less than the cost of nails, less than a meal, less than mercy. The boy looked up at Stroud, his small frame trembling from the cold. "You'll earn your keep," Stroud told him, gripping his shoulder. The child said nothing, but deep in the blank stillness of his gaze, something stirred. Not fear, but an awakening. The journey to Hateville was long, dusty, and cruel. The boy, who would come to be known as Small Thomas, stumbled as he tried to keep up, his twisted legs struggling against the ruts in the dirt road. Stroud walked ahead, never looking back. Each time Thomas fell, the overseer paused only long enough to bark, "Get up." When they arrived at the cotton facility, the afternoon sun had turned the air to iron. The workers paused to stare as Stroud marched the boy through the yard. "This is what 8 cents buys," he announced, gripping the child's neck with his rough hand. "Even cheap things can have use if you know how to handle them." Some of the enslaved men exchanged glances, pity mixed with anger, but they said nothing. They'd learned the cost of speaking up. Stroud assigned the boy a sleeping space in the storage barn, a corner barely large enough for his small frame, and gave him a single blanket and a wooden crate to hold his things. The boy's first meal was a tin cup of cornmeal mush and a sliver of pork, which he ate alone in the shadows. That night, as the machinery clanked and groaned beyond the barn walls, Small Thomas lay awake staring into the darkness, his body aching, his stomach full but his soul hollow. In that silence he made no sound, not a sob, not a prayer. It was as if even grief had been taken from him. The next morning, his work began. Stroud, true to his word, wasted no time. He made Thomas crawl beneath the massive presses to retrieve lost tools and grease the gears, spaces so tight that even grown men hesitated to look inside. "See? Useful," Stroud said with satisfaction, timing the boy with his pocket watch as if measuring an experiment. He took notes on every task, every mistake, recording them in his little leather book. By evening, the boy's clothes were soaked in sweat and machine oil. But when Bess, the cook, slipped him an extra biscuit, she noticed something in his eyes. Not despair, not even exhaustion, but calculation. As weeks passed, Small Thomas learned the rhythm of the machines, the way their gears turned and how the air changed before a press engaged. He listened, he studied, and he remembered. The sign around his neck, the one that read 8-cent boy, hung heavy on his chest. But with every cruel glance, every insult, every moment of humiliation, something hardened inside him. Stroud thought he had purchased weakness. What he didn't realize was that he had paid 8 cents for patience. And patience in the hands of a child who has nothing left to lose can be the most dangerous thing of all. By spring, the boy they called Small Thomas had become part of the rhythm of Hateville. As invisible as the gears that turned within the presses, as constant as the ringing clang of steel on steel. Stroud had built a system around him, a cruel game of reward and punishment that reduced existence to rations and time. He called it training, but it was something far more sinister, a slow and deliberate breaking of the human spirit. Each task came with a time limit, measured to the second on Stroud's pocket watch. If the boy succeeded, he ate. If he failed, he went hungry. The first few weeks left Thomas thin and trembling, his small body aching from crawling through the tight spaces beneath the presses. Yet, somehow, he adapted. His fingers grew steady, his movements precise. He began to understand the breathing of the machines, the way their creaks and sighs carried warnings of when they would lunge to life. The other workers watched with quiet awe and pity as the boy learned to dance between death and duty. To them, he was a ghost, too small to defy, too strong to die. Stroud, seeing this transformation, mistook it for proof of his own genius. He believed he had reshaped something broken into something useful. In truth, he had created something far more dangerous. A child who had learned to survive by watching the world through silence. By April, Stroud took his cruelty to a new level. He had a wooden sign made, crude, pine, burned letters blackened into the grain. 8-cent boy. He hung it around Thomas's neck with a leather cord, forcing him to wear it at all hours. He needs to remember his worth, Stroud told the others. 8 cents. No more, no less. When he's earned that back, maybe I'll take it off. The workers said nothing, though their faces hardened. That sign, more than any whip, was a weapon of humiliation. It turned the boy into a living reminder of their own chains, a symbol of how cheaply life could be bought. The children on nearby plantations whispered stories about him. A cursed child, too small for the fields, too strange for God's mercy. And yet, the longer Thomas wore that sign, the more its meaning began to twist. The weight of it no longer pulled him down. It fueled him. Each letter seared into the wood became a quiet vow. He would prove that his worth couldn't be measured in coins or cruelty. Every insult, every lash of Stroud's tongue, every long night spent cleaning the machines carved patience into his bones. There were moments of mercy, small and fleeting, that kept the boy tethered to life. Bess, the cook, would sneak him bits of cornbread. Prophet, the old mechanic, would whisper warnings about the machinery. "Listen close, child," he said one night, his voice low. "These machines got no heart. They move when told. They crush when told. Don't ever trust 'em." The boy only nodded, his wide eyes glinting in the lamplight. But Prophet noticed something in that gaze, curiosity. Thomas wasn't just afraid of the machines. He was learning them. He studied their gears, their levers, the rhythm of their turning. He understood how pressure built, how metal bent, how much force it took to crush cotton into bales, or anything else that might be caught beneath it. He began to crawl beneath the presses not just because he was ordered to, but because he wanted to. The machines spoke a language only he seemed to hear, and every creak, every hiss, every motion was a word. The boy, who had been bought as a tool, was learning the tools of his own liberation. By the end of summer, even Stroud began to sense something had changed. He still barked orders and recorded every task in his leather book, but sometimes he found the boy watching him, not with fear, but with something colder, more calculating. The overseer mistook it for obedience, pride even, and that was his fatal blindness. He didn't realize that every command, every insult, every cruel smile was being memorized by the very child he thought too broken to understand. The sign around the boy's neck no longer humiliated him. It marked him for purpose. The facility's older slaves began to whisper that maybe God himself had sent this child to Hateville, not as a victim, but as a warning. They said that one day the machines would turn against their master, that the boy would make them sing with blood instead of cotton. And while most dismissed it as dangerous talk, others lowered their heads in quiet agreement. For deep down, in the echoing clang of the cotton press, something was indeed stirring. Not rebellion in the fields, but vengeance in the heart of a child whose worth had been set at 8 cents. As summer deepened into its slow, suffocating heat, the line between man and machine blurred for the boy. To the others in Hateville, the cotton press was an instrument of dread, a roaring metal beast that fed on labor and spat out profit. But to Thomas, it was something else entirely. He didn't just see gears and levers, he saw intention, rhythm, logic. The press became his tutor, its groans and clicks a secret alphabet only he seemed to understand. Every day he crawled beneath its belly, oiling joints, tightening bolts, and feeling the pulse of its movements. Each sound carried meaning, the wheeze of pressure building, the sigh before release, the tremor of steel shifting weight. He began to map it all in his mind, turning its design into memory. Prophet noticed the change and tried to warn him. "Don't get too close to that thing," the old man whispered. "Ain't nothing human in it." But Thomas didn't answer. He wasn't afraid of the machine anymore. The others saw him as the child who worked without complaint, who did what he was told. What they couldn't see, what even Stroud didn't see, was that every motion, every turn of the wheel, was becoming a rehearsal. Tobias Stroud, meanwhile, grew restless. He'd noticed how smoothly the machines ran since Thomas's arrival. Fewer jams, fewer accidents, fewer delays. He took it as validation, proof that his method worked. He began to treat the boy not as property, but as a strange sort of project. "You see, gentlemen," he told Gantry one evening as they walked the floor, "even the weakest creature can be shaped into something useful with enough discipline." Gantry nodded absently, uninterested in philosophy, focused only on output. But Stroud kept talking, his voice swelling with pride. "He's learned to think like a machine. I've trained him to move when told, stop when told, and wait until commanded." He smiled faintly. He's the perfect worker. Yet, in the shadows behind them, Thomas heard every word, his small hands tightening around the handle of the oil can he carried. That night, as he sat by his wooden crate in the barn, the words echoed in his head. Perfect worker. The phrase twisted in his mind until it became something else. A challenge. If Stroud believed he had built a machine out of flesh and pain, then one day Thomas would prove how perfectly that machine could turn against its maker. Over time, Thomas's fascination with the press became something almost spiritual. While others feared its noise, he found comfort in it. When it was silent, he felt uneasy, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. He began to dream in its rhythm, short bursts of motion followed by the heavy thud of compression. Sometimes, late at night, he would sneak into the facility, lantern in hand, and stand before the giant wheel, tracing its iron rim with trembling fingers. He knew exactly how long it took to build enough pressure to crush a bale, exactly where the safety latch caught, exactly how much weight the platform could bear. Prophet caught him once and shook his head. "You're walking with the devil's tools, boy," he said quietly. But Thomas only whispered, "The devil built them. Maybe they'll listen to one of his own." There was something chilling in his calmness, a patience that no child should have, a stillness too precise to be innocent. Hateville had taught him to obey, but the machine had taught him something far more dangerous: how to wait. By late August, even the nights couldn't cool the air inside the press room. The iron floor held the heat like a furnace, and the smell of oil clung to everything. Stroud, his temper worsened by drink and the season, had grown crueler, unpredictable. He'd lash out for the smallest error, often at Thomas, whose silence seemed to enrage him most. Once, after striking the boy with the edge of a tool, Stroud leaned close and hissed, "You're lucky I made you something. Without me, you'd still be rotting in a cage." Thomas didn't flinch, didn't even look away. "Yes, sir," he said softly. But later, when Stroud left, the boy ran his hand along the iron wheel and whispered words no one heard. "Without you, I'd still be alive." It was not hatred that filled him then. It was clarity. The machine had become his mirror, and in it he saw what he had to do. Everything he'd learned, every creak, every turn, every measured breath of metal, had been leading here. Soon it would not be cotton pressed beneath that wheel. Soon it would be Tobias Stroud. The night it happened, the air hung thick and wet, heavy with the scent of rain that never came. Most of the workers had retired to their quarters, their bodies drained from another day of endless labor. The facility was quieter than usual, save for the steady drip of oil and the faint hum of the cooling machines. Tobias Stroud stayed late, as he often did during harvest season, pacing the floor like a restless predator guarding his domain. The lantern light flickered across his face, deepening the lines carved by anger and pride. On the far side of the room, small Thomas moved silently, wiping down the base of the main press. To any observer, it looked like a normal evening, a man overseeing his work, a boy performing his duties. But beneath that quiet scene, something far older and darker was coiling tight. Stroud had been drinking again, his words slurred and bitter. "You think you're something now, don't you?" he muttered, staggering closer to the boy. "Ain't no one ever gonna see you as anything more than what I made you. 8 cents. That's all you'll ever be worth." He laughed, a sound sharp as broken glass. Thomas didn't respond. He just stared at the great wheel before him, his fingers resting lightly on its cold, familiar iron. For a long time, Stroud's laughter filled the air, echoing against the walls, until the boy reached up and locked the door. What happened next would never be fully recorded, but what the sheriff would later piece together came from the machine itself. The scuffs, the marks, the sequence of movements that told a story no one wanted to believe. Stroud, realizing he was locked in, barked orders for the boy to open the door. When Thomas didn't move, he struck him. Once, twice, hard enough to draw blood. The boy fell, then rose again, slow and deliberate. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply turned the wheel's handle once, a single, quiet motion that released a deep mechanical sigh from the press. Stroud froze. "Stop that," he snapped. But Thomas didn't stop. The wheel turned again. And again. The old iron groaned, gears grinding to life like something ancient awakening. The overseer lunged forward, but the boy dodged, slipping behind the control lever. The wheel turned a 4th time, then a 5th, the press lowering inch by inch. "I said stop!" Stroud shouted, grabbing for the lever. But Thomas had wedged the safety pin loose hours earlier, a small, invisible act of preparation. The mechanism was fully engaged now, unstoppable. Stroud's face went pale as he realized what was happening. He stumbled backward, shouting, cursing, demanding. The boy didn't answer. He just kept turning, steady, rhythmic, until the shouting turned to pleading. Some would later claim that the boy sang as he turned the wheel, a low hum that sounded almost like a hymn. Others said he spoke only once, his voice soft and eerily calm. 17 turns. No one knows which version was true. What is certain is that by the time the press reached its final descent, the room was silent except for the sound of metal settling under pressure. 17 full rotations. Each one deliberate, each one counted. When the last creak faded, Thomas stepped back and looked at what he'd done. Stroud's body was pinned beneath the massive plate, still, his head gone, crushed beyond recognition. The boy stared for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for the small wooden sign hanging around his neck, tore it free, and placed it on the platform beside the overseer's body. The burned letters, 8-cent boy, faced upward, glowing faintly in the lantern light. Without another glance, he blew out the flame, opened the door, and vanished into the night. Outside, the moon hung low over the fields, casting the cotton in shades of silver. The wind moved through it like a whisper, not of fear, but of release. By dawn, the workers arrived to find the scene as if frozen in time. Stroud's body lay perfectly aligned beneath the press, the wooden stool beside the wheel still bearing the prints of small bare feet. The sheriff who examined it later would say that the wheel had been turned precisely 17 times. No more, no less. A level of control impossible for a child without knowledge or intent. But in Hateville, no one questioned the details too loudly. The white owners called it an accident, a tragic mishap with the machinery, unwilling to admit that one of their own had been brought down by what they considered property. The enslaved, however, knew the truth. They didn't speak of it openly, not at first, but when they passed the cotton fields at dusk, they would murmur, 17 turns. It became both prayer and promise, a story whispered to children who dared to dream of justice. Somewhere out beyond the river, small footprints faded into the mud, leading toward the pines and the promise of freedom. Whether the boy lived or died, no one could say for sure. But his act had cracked something in the heart of Hateville that would never mend again. When Sheriff Edmund Howell arrived at the Hateville cotton facility the next morning, the crowd had already gathered, men whispering in disbelief, women clutching their shawls, and workers standing in silent, fearful rows. The overseer's death had spread through the county like wildfire, and everyone had a theory, but no one dared to speak it aloud. Howell, a man of 49 with a stiff jaw and eyes that missed little, stepped off his horse and immediately sensed something was wrong beyond the obvious. He had been sheriff long enough to know the smell of lies, and the air here reeked of them. The press loomed over the scene like an idol, its iron mouth closed, its purpose fulfilled. The body of Tobias Stroud lay beneath a white sheet, but the way it bulged where the skull should have been told Howell all he needed to know about the violence of it. He crouched beside the machine, examining the wheel. The iron was slick with oil, the bolts freshly greased. Someone had tended this device with precision. Then his gaze fell upon the small wooden stool, roughly made, worn smooth by small hands. "Who built this?" he asked. No one answered. The workers avoided his eyes, staring at the ground. Howell's attention shifted to the sign lying beside the corpse. 8-cent boy. The sheriff straightened slowly, his hand tightening on the brim of his hat. "Find him," he ordered. The search began at dawn and stretched long into the day. Howell rode with 2 deputies through the fields and into the woods beyond the river, following faint trails where the soil had been disturbed by small footprints. They led toward Redemption Creek, a narrow stretch of murky water that twisted through the pines like a black vein. The sheriff dismounted and crouched by the bank where he found a scrap of fabric caught on a root, coarse linen, torn, stained with oil and blood. "He came this way," Howell muttered. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. "Ain't no way that boy's still alive," one said. "Not out here." But Howell wasn't so sure. Something about the act, the deliberate precision of those 17 turns, haunted him. This wasn't blind rage, it was intelligence. Purpose. "If he's alive," Howell said quietly, "he's not running from what he did. He's running from what we'll do to him when we find him." They followed the creek for hours, but the trail eventually vanished into the reeds. At dusk, they stopped to rest. The air was thick with mosquitoes, and the water glistened like ink in the fading light. Somewhere nearby, an owl called. Howell turned his eyes toward the trees and thought not for the first time that maybe the boy was closer than any of them realized. Watching. Waiting. Back in Hateville, fear began to ferment into legend. The white townsfolk wanted the matter buried, but the enslaved whispered that the land itself had chosen vengeance. They said the press had finally eaten its fill, that the boy had turned iron into justice. Howell spent the following days interviewing workers, but all he found were blank stares and trembling hands. "Did you see him?" he'd ask. "No, sir." "Did you hear anything?" "Just the machine, sir." Not a single person claimed to know where Thomas had gone, yet Howell could feel their quiet defiance, the way they glanced toward the floor whenever his questions got too close to truth. It wasn't fear of him that silenced them, it was loyalty to something greater. By the 4th day, the sheriff began to realize that the entire facility was protecting the boy, even in absence. At night, he reread his notes by lamplight, staring at the phrase he'd written again and again. 17 turns. It didn't sound like murder anymore. It sounded like a message. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the small stool, the smeared footprints, the torn fabric, and he couldn't stop wondering. What kind of mind, what kind of child, plans something like that? By the end of the week, Howell was ordered by Gantry himself to close the investigation. It was an accident, the cotton broker insisted, a misfire. Tobias should have been more careful. But Howell didn't believe it. He knew the truth lived somewhere between the silence of the workers and the blood beneath that press. He left Hateville reluctantly, riding out past the endless rows of cotton glowing pale under the moonlight. Near the tree line, he paused and looked back, For a moment he thought he saw movement near the barn, a small figure standing just inside the doorway, motionless, watching him. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Maybe it had never been there. Still, he tipped his hat toward the darkened fields, muttering a prayer he couldn't quite name. "Rest easy, boy," he whispered. "Whatever devil made this world, you gave him his due." And as he rode off into the humid night, the wind picked up, carrying the faintest creak of iron from the direction of the press, a sound that could have been metal shifting in the heat. Or maybe, just maybe, the ghost of a wheel turning one last time. For years after the murder, Hateville carried the weight of that night like a scar that refused to heal. The cotton kept coming, the machines kept turning, but something inside the town had changed. The overseer's death was spoken of only in whispers, passed between nervous lips and dark corners. To the white owners it became an embarrassment, a tale that suggested weakness in a system built on control. So they rewrote it. In the official records, Tobias Stroud's death was listed as an industrial mishap resulting from worker negligence. The stool, the footprints, the sign, all quietly removed before the state inspector arrived. The sheriff's report was altered and his notes vanished soon after. The story of the 8-cent boy was buried under paperwork and time. Yet, not everyone forgot. Among the enslaved, his memory lived on like a secret hymn. They whispered his name only at night, by the fires, in songs that sounded like sorrow but carried pride in their undertone. 17 turns, they sang softly, as if repeating it could make the world tilt a little more toward justice. When freedom finally came years later, the newly freed still spoke of him, their voices trembling with something between grief and reverence. The boy had vanished, yes, but the idea of him lingered, haunting the soil he left behind. By the time the Civil War swept through Georgia, Hateville's cotton empire had begun to crumble. Sherman's march reduced the once proud town to ashes. The grand houses burned, and the fields that once shimmered with white now smoldered under gray smoke. The cotton facility itself was gutted by flame. The iron presses melted, twisted, fused into grotesque sculptures of war's aftermath. When Union soldiers stumbled across the ruins in 1864, they found the remnants of ledgers charred black, bits of machinery buried beneath layers of soot, and in one corner, a half-buried wooden sign, its letters barely legible, 8-cent boy. The soldiers didn't know the meaning of it. To them, it was just debris from another fallen southern town. But for those who once labored there, that sign was sacred. Prophet, now old and frail, returned to the ruins years later and found that same sign still half buried under the ash. He took it, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it with him until his dying day. When his grandchildren asked about it, he would only say, "That's the price of justice." He never explained further. Some things, he believed, were better left to silence. Decades passed, and Hateville was reborn, or at least pretended to be. By the early 1900s, it was a sleepy town with a new cotton gin and a small railway depot. Most of the residents had never heard of Tobias Stroud or the boy who ended him. History, as it often does, had done its work, polishing away the horror, sanding down the truth. Then, in 1911, a historian named Everett C. Langley came through the area collecting oral accounts of antebellum Georgia. He was a Harvard man, eager to romanticize the Old South, but his trip took an unexpected turn when he met a woman named Ruthie Mae Prophet, the granddaughter of the mechanic who once worked the presses. Over tea, she told him a story her grandfather had whispered on his deathbed. It began with a machine and a boy, and it ended with 17 turns of iron. Langley didn't believe it at first. A child committing such an act seemed impossible. But when Ruthie showed him the old sign, blackened, brittle, its letters faint but still visible, he realized he'd stumbled upon something history had tried to erase. He spent weeks combing through archives, finding scraps of evidence buried in forgotten ledgers and dusty courthouse drawers. The name Tobias Stroud appeared again and again, always followed by the same date, September 14th, 1851. The death was listed as accidental, but in one ledger, barely visible beneath smudged ink, were 3 faint words: "Child not found." Langley published his findings in a small pamphlet titled "The 8-Cent Boy, a Legend of Hateville," printed privately in 1913. It sold only a few dozen copies before fading into obscurity, dismissed by academics as folklore. But among those who read it, the story struck a chord. It was reprinted in local newspapers, retold in sermons and schoolyards. Some called it a ghost tale, others a parable about justice and cruelty. Over time, the line between fact and legend blurred completely. The boy became a symbol, sometimes of vengeance, sometimes of divine retribution. In Hateville, mothers would still whisper to misbehaving children, "Don't make the press turn 17 times," half warning, half prayer. And though the original cotton press was gone, its shadow remained, not in the metal, but in memory. Every few years, someone claimed to hear it at night, deep beneath the ground, that faint mechanical creak echoing like a heartbeat in the soil. Maybe it was the wind through old pipes, or maybe it was something else, the ghost of machinery that once crushed more than cotton. Either way, Hateville never slept easily again. More than a century has passed since the night the cotton press sang its final note in Hateville, and yet the story of the 8-cent boy refuses to die. It drifts through Georgia's humid air like a ghost, whispered in barbershops and back porches, told in classrooms where brave teachers dare to pierce the silence of polite history. Most legends fade with time, but this one lingers because it carries a question too heavy to bury. How much is a life worth? In the ledgers of Hateville, Thomas's price was written clearly, 8 cents. But those 8 cents bought more than a child. They bought a mirror held up to an entire nation's soul. Every generation that rediscovers his story sees its own reflection there. The arrogance that allowed one man to own another, the indifference that turned cruelty into commerce, and the quiet strength that survives even the deepest oppression. The boy who vanished into the pines became more than a name. He became the weight on history's conscience, proof that justice, when ignored for too long, will find its own brutal language. Some say he died that night. Others claim he reached the coast and slipped away on a ship bound for the north. But the truth, in a way, doesn't matter. The legend of the 8-cent boy became larger than the boy himself. When you walk through modern Hateville, or what remains of it, you can still feel the past pressing through the earth. The cotton fields are gone now, replaced by parking lots and gas stations. But when the wind blows just right, the air still carries the faint scent of oil and soil, a ghost of the industry that once ruled this land. A historical marker stands near the site of the old facility, its bronze surface polished by curious hands. It reads simply, "On this site stood the Hateville Cotton Press, destroyed 1864. Local legend speaks of a child who defied his master. Truth uncertain, memory eternal." Tourists stop, take photos, move on. But for those who know the full story, that marker feels like a confession disguised as history. Beneath it lies ground that has absorbed too much: sweat, tears, blood, and the sound of 17 turns of iron. When the sun sets, the shadow of the trees stretches across the marker, and for a brief moment, the past seems alive again, as if the land itself remembers the weight of what happened here and refuses to let it fade. Historians still argue about the boy's existence. Some insist he was real, pointing to fragments of records, eyewitness notes, and the scorched sign discovered in the ruins. Others dismiss him as a myth born from guilt, a story invented to humanize the inhuman. But myths often rise from truths too painful to record. Whether Thomas lived or not, he represents every nameless soul who was bought, sold, and broken under the same sun. His act, real or imagined, speaks to something universal, the moment when the powerless refuse to accept the shape of their chains. That is why the story endures. It isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming humanity in a world that denied it. Every culture has its reckoning tale, and this was the South's, not the polished version of plantations and hospitality, but the one written in sweat and iron. The 8-cent boy was not a saint or a monster. He was something far more terrifying to the people who ruled him, proof that even the smallest voice can echo louder than empire. And maybe that's the lesson Hateville leaves behind. Justice doesn't always wear robes or speak from pulpits. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the steady hands of a child turning a wheel 17 times while the world sleeps. Every generation inherits its own machinery of cruelty, built from ignorance, greed, or indifference, and every generation must decide whether to keep it running or bring it to a stop. The story of the 8-cent boy is not about vengeance alone. It's about consequence, the idea that the weight we place on others will one day press back on us. In the quiet hours of the South, when the cicadas fall silent and the air grows still, some say you can still hear that wheel turning faintly underground, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Because history, like iron, remembers pressure. And some debts, no matter how long they sleep beneath the soil, never really rest.